Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. I'd like to thank Prairie Lights for sharing Michael Perry with all of us. Michael Perry is a New York Times best-selling author, humorist, and radio show host from New Auburn, Wisconsin. His best-selling memoirs include Population 485, Truck, A Love Story, Coop, and Visiting Tom. His first book for young readers, The Scavengers, was published in 2014. Raised on a small Midwestern dairy farm, Perry put himself through nursing school while working on a ranch in Wyoming, then wound up writing by happy accident for all of us, I think. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in rural Wisconsin, where he serves on the local volunteer fire and rescue service and is an intermittent pig farmer, and you can ask him about that when he takes questions later on. He hosts the nationally syndicated Tent Show Radio, performs widely as a humorist, and tours with his band, The Long Beds, currently recording their 3rd album for Ambledown Records. He has recorded 3 live humor albums, including Never Stand Behind a Sneezing Cow and the Clodhopper Monologues. Tonight, Michael will read from his novel for adults, Jesus Cow. Please help me welcome Michael.
Thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. I'm out on tour right now for this book, The Jesus Cow, and I think the best way to start is just to read the prologue. On Christmas Eve itself, the bachelor Harley Jackson stepped into his barn and beheld there illuminated in the straw a smallish newborn bull calf, upon whose flank was born the very image of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. "Well," said Harley, "that's trouble." So I could pretty much just go home after that now. So Harley's a bachelor, a longtime bachelor, and people always want to know, how do you come up with characters in fiction, how much of it is real, and I ain't saying. But my 2 brothers and I, before any of us got married, and it's been a while since I told the story, so give me plus or minus 2 years, but we had an accumulated 112 years of bachelorhood between us before the first one of us got married. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that, but we don't have time to get into it this evening. So Harley, the main character, the Jesus Cow, he is a bachelor. And he's got a buddy named Billy, and he turns to Billy when he needs advice. And Billy considers himself a homespun philosopher. And he often, throughout the book, will offer little nuggets of what he wants to pass off as philosophy. But if you're paying attention, you realize he's just quoting Waylon Jennings lyrics. So Harley calls Billy. He finds this calf and he knows he needs some advice, so he calls Billy in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve to come over. Billy Tripp opened Harley's barn door and fully filled the frame. Well over 6 feet tall and burly, with the stature of those men who carry a 70-pound overage like 7, he arrived clad in grim sweatpants and a capacious parka, and notwithstanding the Christmas Eve snow, stood shod in orange rubber clogs. He wore a beard the size of an otter. Billy was a decorated combat veteran whose wartime injuries had at one point put him flat on his back for the better part of a year. He and Harley were well along in their friendship before Billy shared the whole story. "Anybody who says they're above it all has never been beneath it all," he said by way of conclusion, and then never spoke of it again. He lived surrounded by stacks of books and an innumerable census of cats in a single wide trailer on a sliver of property purchased from Harley's father during the years Harley was away at college in the city of Clearwater, an hour south of Swivel. Upon his return home, Harley resented the presence of the trailer at the far end of the pasture and by default its occupant, But one afternoon, as he struggled to repair the frozen apron chain of his father's manure spreader, the sky darkened, and it was Billy, blocking the sun. "As the worm gear turns, eh?" said Billy. The combination of literate humor and obscure manure-handling technology knowledge appealed to Harley, and a low-key conversation ensued. Now Harley considered Billy his best friend, although he did not ever care for the term, implying as it did that life was a pageant. Like Harley, Billy was also a bachelor. The two of them liked to get together and not talk much. After a childhood of daily dairy chores, Harley had sworn he would never again milk a cow, but he retained a farm kid's atavistic affection for fresh-skimmed cream over cornflakes. When he broached the possibility with Billy, who subsisted on a military pension and disability drawn on his injuries, Billy saw the milk cow as a means to defray his prohibitive monthly cat food expenses, and thus offered to split the milking chores. With this agreement in hand, Harley obtained a bred milk cow from one of the few remaining dairy farmers in the county. Billy was present the day she was led off the back of the cattle trailer. "Tina Turner," said Billy. "Huh?" said Harley. "Tina Turner. We'll call her Tina Turner." Harley had tried in vain to make any connection, some resemblance of hairstyle or mannerism, a certain strength to the gait. "But I don't—" "Not the point," said Billy, seeing Harley there puzzling. "But why?" "Respect must be paid," said Billy, his definitive tone making it clear he considered the answer self-evident and the discussion closed. Indeed, it was not uncommon in these parts to choose animal names for honorific purposes. Harley himself had once named a Holstein heifer calf after a high school girlfriend. Sadly, the relationship ended before the calf was weaned. Now, as the two men watched, Tina Turner licked her calf from stem to stern, clearing the last of the amniotic fluid. At the moment, Billy was unable to see the image of Jesus, his view being blocked broadside by Tina. Then the cow laid on an especially aggressive lick, and the calf stumbled into the open. The hair across its rib cage was slicked and whorled, but even thus distorted, there was no mistaking the image made manifest. "You got the Son of God there, bud," said Billy, "with a cowlick." "Oh yeah, well, it was there. What do you think? You people are better than that?" This was a stylized Jesus, rendered in black and white splotches, like clip art from the cover of a 1970s family planning brochure, but immediately recognizable as the standard doe-eyed Lutheran hippie iteration. Harley looked up at his friend. "What do you think?" "Get a lawyer," said Billy, "and start printing T-shirts." So one of the things that Harley is up against is that a developer named Knut Sorensen bought up most of his father's farm and put up a development. And the developer, Knut Sorensen, is trying to get the rest of Harley's farm. Harley is on a 15-acre remnant. And Harley's trying to fight him off, and it's getting kind of dirty. Knut is pulling some legal tricks on him. And so Knut is seen as somewhat of a big deal in the little town of Swivel, where Harley lives, because the population in Swivel is 562, but Knut is from Boomler, which is 9 miles down the road, and they have 4 digits on their population sign. So he's a bit of a big deal. And this is just a little description of how it is he managed to get the Swivel Village Board on his side, the development. Clute's charm offensive had begun the night he pulled up before the Swivel Village Hall in a monstrously jacked-up second-hand Hummer, sporting plein air stars and stripes on both doors and personalized plates reading 1 MPG. The first Hummer I ever saw in my life was in Nashville, Tennessee, and it had personalized plates that said 1 MPG. And I remember thinking at the time, bud, it's a free country, you do whatever you want, but the people with the pitchforks are coming for you first. So he has personalized plates reading 1 MPG. Clute intended this abbreviation as a boastful toast to conspicuous consumption, but it went slightly awry when one of the locals peeping out through the nicotine-bleared window of the Buck Rub bar read it as shorthand for I am pig. Even had Clute known this, he would not have been deterred, for he was not one to be deterred, as indicated by the fact that before he switched off the Hummer, it was reverberating to the sounds of a motivational business audiobook titled Stomp Your Way to Success, A Clodhopper Walks All Over Wall Street. In fact, the passenger seat of the SUV was littered with motivational business audiobooks, the likes of 12 Steps to the Top Floor, Scream Like You Mean It, and Set Sail, 7 Shipmasters Share Their Success Stories. What Clute lacked in business acumen, he made up for in body mass, cologne, and confident aphorisms. And this was enough to convince the Swivel Village Board to approve his plans and the bank to hand over money. There was much talk of jobs and an expanded tax base and repeated invocation of the two most magically twinned words in the star-spangled lexicon, growth and progress. By the time negotiations concluded, the Swivel Village Board would have been willing to strap on tool belts and raise the houses themselves. In short order, Clute Sorensen snapped up Harley's father's farmland, which, not coincidentally, was precipitously close to being foreclosed on by the very same bank financing Clute, divvied it up with poorly built roads, slapped together a dozen split levels, and began handing out brochures. Clover Blossom Estates, a sweet life at a sweet price. And right about then, the real estate market climbed over the railing of a very tall bridge, closed its eyes, and jumped. So Clute winds up with this half-finished development full of half-full houses, and he's trying to sell them, and that makes his financial problems even worse, and then he, in turn, increases the pressure on Harley, and that's one of the narrative lines. So all through this tour, I've been getting asked in interviews, were you nervous about writing this book? And the answer is yes, especially as it regards the title. So the title is The Jesus Cow. I've never really come up with the titles for my books very often, and I never expected that was going to be the title of this book. I use a working title throughout the process, and then the publishers almost always are the ones who wind up choosing the final title. And I've really, out of all the books I've written, I've only come up with the titles really for 2, and one of those was, I came up with the title for the book Truck. So, pretty proud of that one. And actually, of course, that book has a subtitle, so the full title and subtitle is Truck, A Love Story. I get asked in interviews all the time, is that a love story about a truck or a woman? And I always reply with a question of my own, is there not room enough in a man's heart for both? And your answers will vary. It is a book about the resurrection of the 1951 L123 quarter-ton long bed International Harvester pickup truck. And I do love that truck very much. It was my only vehicle for years. But it had started to rot away in my driveway, and I had to get it running again. And so I thought, well, I'll write a book about it, and then, it'll all be tax deductible. And So the problem was, although I'm a blue-collar guy, I was raised on a farm and worked on a ranch, and I can do some basic mechanicking. Like I can change out a spun bearing, I can run a gas hatchet, and I can do some bubblegum welding. But once you lift the hood and you're under the hood there, I got nothing. It just does, and it's embarrassing to admit that as a guy with my background. My brothers are very competent in this regard, and although because of how I was raised, I know how to act once you raise the hood, which is really half the battle, right? So, so you pop the hood on the old truck, and then you got to lean in there. Right. Spit a little bit, scratch. And then at some point you straighten up and you back away and you utter what is my all-time favorite guys looking under hoods at engines line, which is you go, yeah, looks like we're going to have to pull her. And I got no idea what you do with her once you pull her. Well, I know you got to pull her. And so in order to write that book, I've often said I had to enlist the help of someone who actually knew what they were doing. And so I got my brother-in-law, Mark, to help me. And he became a very central figure in the book, Truck, A Love Story. And my brother-in-law, Mark, he's one of these guys, of a weekend, he likes to watch him a little NASCAR while drinking a Busch beer and sitting in his recliner, which has been reupholstered in genuine tree bark camouflage fabric. But he's also an extremely talented machinist, and he spends his days designing and fabricating things that the rest of us sit on or pull on every day without giving it a second thought. And he's a good mechanic, and he can do body work, so he was perfect for the book. And also, as I say in the book, he is a good husband to my sister, and she, frankly, is no walk in the park. So we as a family are grateful to him for the good work he does. The only other title of my books that I really had much to do with is the book Coop, which is about our little family. So in Truck, I actually wrote about, it is a book about resurrecting the truck. It's also, believe it or not, and you wouldn't know this from looking at the cover, but it's a gardening book. It is a book that describes a year in the life of my garden. Life being an interesting choice of words when it comes to me and gardens. And the reason I wanted to write a gardening book is I'd had it up to here with happy gardening books. I felt it was time for a grim gardening book, and I'm the guy to write it. As a matter of fact, so it's laid out so each chapter describes, each chapter represents a month in the year of the life of my garden. And so, for instance, my very favorite chapter in the book is also my favorite gardening month of the year in northern Wisconsin, January. Because that's when the seed catalogs come, hopes are high, reality has yet to intrude, and you sit down with the catalog and a cup of tea, and there's the beautiful pictures and the wonderful descriptions, and you go and you order stuff that you're never even going to plant, let alone see through to fruition. And I think I wrote a line in that book that's proven to be somewhat popular, which is, seed catalogs are responsible for more unfulfilled fantasies than Enron and Playboy combined. So, and then the third part of the book, Truck, A Love Story, it really is a love story. I was a bachelor for 39 years, and then in the book, I write about the fact that one day I went to the library and I met a woman. And I've told the American Library Association that they are free to use that quote in all their promotional materials. So far, nothing. I think they're really missing the boat. And so that book ends. I don't want to give away a spoiler, but been married for 10 years now. So the next book was Coop, and Coop was about our little family. I have a daughter. When I met my wife, she had a 3-year-old daughter. I often say I don't care for the term stepdaughter. I don't find it offensive or troubling or anything like that. What I've always said is that the term does a fine job. It is sufficient in conveying the situation. It is utterly insufficient in conveying the heart. And I was given the gift of a wonderful word by a poet friend of mine, a backwoods living Vietnam vet, reclusive poet friend of mine, who told me one time, she is not your stepdaughter, she's your given daughter. And I love that word, and I love that girl. And in that book, I write about becoming a father, and I write about the relationship between me and her father. Her father lives in Colorado, has since married, has 2 boys. She has 2 brothers. I'm grateful to say that we are on good terms. We go to visit them. They come to visit us. And so in the book Coop, I write about our little family of 3 moving to a farm at the far end of a dead-end road, fairly isolated. And my wife at the time is very pregnant, and she announces to me that she wants to have the baby in our old rickety farmhouse. And I said, and then her gaze hardened, and I realized she was serious, and that furthermore, I didn't have a vote. So it also is a book about having a baby at home. Our second daughter was indeed born upstairs in the old farmhouse. But my favorite story, when I talk about the relationship between our 2 families, it can be hard to encapsulate. And my favorite story that sums up our relationship is that throughout the pregnancy of our second child, we were in constant contact with what we refer to as our Colorado family, giving them updates. And the big day arrives. We're at home. The baby's born. The infant is cradled in its mother's arms. Everything has gone fine. And my given daughter, who is 7 at the time, says, "Can I call my dad? Can I give him the news?" And I said, "Absolutely. Let him know we have a new sister in the family. All is well." She goes pelting down the stairs. I hear her pick up the phone. I hear her dial. And then I hear his voice at the other end. And with no preface whatsoever, she says, "Well, you're a dad again." Yeah, kind of. So, a big part of the book, Coop, was us moving to the farm and raising our own pigs and chickens, and much of the book consists of me trying to finish a chicken coop with the help of my buddy Mills. And so it seemed natural that Coop would make a great title for that book, and we were all very happy with it. And then the book was released, and on the day the book was released, I started out on my book tour. The very first radio interview I did, live on the air, and the gentleman says, "Ladies and gentlemen, today on our show, Michael Perry, author of the brand new book, Co-op." I said, never saw that coming. Probably should have. So while I'm writing The Jesus Cow, I just have The Jesus Cow as the working title, assuming there will be a meeting in New York and they'll come up with something different, better, whatever. And then one day, a PDF of the cover arrives in my email, and there it is, and it's The Jesus Cow, and they've already filed it with the Library of Congress. And so I was a little uneasy about that, and part of my unease is that I reserve the right to find humor in all things, including religion. And I was raised in an obscure fundamentalist Christian sect. I like to say that because it makes people uncomfortable. They think we hoarded diesel fuel and fertilizer, and we did. But mainly we just used it to plant corn. And in truth, it was a fairly conservative fundamentalist by definition, and yet I had a loving, gentle, quiet childhood. My parents, here's what I say. I now describe myself as a bumbling agnostic with traces of amateur existentialism. Or to put it another way, I ain't looking for a fight, I'm just looking. And so I can no longer pretend that I believe everything that my parents believe, but I try every day to be more like them. They have set such an example for me and for now my children. And so, while I reserve the right to find humor in religion and to write a book like this, I wanted to somehow strike that balance and have some contemplative things in there as well. And so, first of all, the premise of the book is not at all far-fetched. I mean, this is a comic novel. There are things in here that are over the top, hopefully for humorous effect, the reader will decide. But the concept is not at all far-fetched. The concept of this book is based on something called pareidolia. And I may not be pronouncing it right. I know how to spell it and I know what it means. I just don't have occasion to use it in conversation a lot down at the feed mill. But pareidolia is basically this ability of the human mind to look at several objects and draw them together and see what they want to see. And so it's this reason that once a week on the interwebs, someone is sending around a photograph of a grilled cheese where they can see the face of Christ, or they see a wet spot on a wall and it looks like the Virgin Mary. This is very common. And as a matter of fact, I used to do a lot of writing in a coffee shop in Nashville, Tennessee called Bongo Java. And when you went to pay for your coffee at Bongo Java, beneath the cash register, they had a little glassed-in shrine which, under lights, contained a cinnamon bun said to resemble the likeness of Mother Teresa. And indeed, it kind of did look like Mother Teresa, although it helped if you knew ahead of time it was supposed to look like Mother Teresa. And they called it the nun bun. And they sold nun bun coffee cups and nun bun t-shirts, or at least they did until they received a letter from Mother Teresa's attorneys. Now, to be fair to Mother Teresa, she didn't object to them having fun or selling the t-shirts. She did object to anyone making money off her countenance. Fair enough. So, and also, in 2005, someone broke into Bongo Java Coffee House in the dead of night and stole the nun bun. Now, it was rumored to have resurfaced sometime later in Seattle, but we're pretty sure that one's a fake. Those of us who follow this pretty closely. So the idea, as a guy who grew up on a farm filled with Holsteins, and I love Holstein cows, and I think they're beautiful, it just occurred to me, well, what if a guy had a cow give birth to a calf, and one of the spots could be construed to be seen as the face of Christ? And then that was the seed for the book, and then I just let things unfold from there. So as I said, I wanted to make sure, though, that I didn't just go for laughs. And so there's a character in the book who's a relatively minor character throughout, fairly quiet and unobtrusive. And she's a very devout Catholic widow. And she, too, is based on three people in my life. Two very devout Catholic widows, and then a very devout Catholic widower, a gentleman I grew up next to on the farm. The other woman was someone from my hometown. And then the third woman is someone she's actually our neighbor now out in the country. She lives in the valley down below us. And so I created this character who is a devout Catholic widow. And when I got done, I realized two things. A, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't crossing the line. And B, I'm not Catholic, so I needed someone Catholic to fact check it. So when the final draft was ready to go, I took the sections that have this character in them, and I took them down in the valley, and I knocked on Ginny, that's her name. I knocked on her door, and I said, Ginny, would you mind, as a devout Catholic, reading all these sections? Now, I have a backbone. I'm not going to just change something just because you don't like it. But A, if you find anything that's factually incorrect, please save me from myself. Let's fix it now. And then secondly, if you see anything that you think is really over the top or just overtly hurtful, we can discuss it. And part of my concern was specific. I have a character in there called Bishop Burkle, and he's pretty thinly veiled reference to a real bishop, a bishop who, I think in Population 45, or possibly Truck, I wrote about our local Catholic church in our little town where I was raised, built by farmers and paid for by farmers, and the bishop shut it down in what appeared to most of us, the Catholics included, a pretty cold-hearted economics move. And I actually attended the final service, the deconsecration, out of respect to my neighbors who had opened the Catholic Church to my non-Catholic brother when he lost his wife and the funeral was too large to fit anywhere else, and to my Catholic neighbors who had been good to me as a child. And so there was this real-life bishop, and when he came and shut down the church, and I just watched how he functioned. He was cold, man, and I said, in the book, I said, that boy is going places. And it's one of the few times in my life I've been right about something, because in short order, he became the Archbishop of St. Louis, and after that became, I believe, a cardinal, and was working over there across the sea. The new guy demoted him. Not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying it happened. But anyway, in the Jesus Cow, there's a reference to this Bishop Burkle, and it's pretty clear that it's a reference to this gentleman. And I was a little nervous about what Ginny would say. And when I got the manuscript back from her, it had a number of little pink Post-it notes in it. And sure enough, right underneath the reference to Bishop Burkle, there was a pink Post-it note. And Ginny had written, "Yes," and underlined it 3 times. And I thought, well, she's on the team. And so I felt that I was kind of safe then. And so there was only one correction that Ginny made that was of significance. And boy, am I glad she did, because I released a little bit of the early draft online and got some immediate feedback from the Catholics. I had said that this character would go into the church in the morning, light a candle, and then she would go through the Stations of the Cross and then come back out, and that she was in there for under 10 minutes. And Ginny said, "Oh, you can't do the Stations of the Cross under 10 minutes. And she said, "If you do, you're not doing them right." And so she kind of saved me from my Protestant self there, and I appreciated that. So this is a section that describes that character. Christmas morning broke to the rumble of a junk truck. Margaret Magdalene Jankowski came downshifting off the overpass and past the old water tower. Her split-shift Ford straight truck squatting to the overloads beneath the weight of a dismantled combine. Meg was ninja grade with a blowtorch, a rusted harrow, and a flattened Ford Festiva. The snug balance of the load, testament to the fact that this was a woman who knew her way around ratchet straps and chain boomers. The truck pulled into the quick pump, and Meg, a slight and nimble widow in a watch cap and greasy coveralls, jumped out to pump the fuel. After paying cash for the gas, Meg turned left out of the lot and drove the truck a block into Swivel, pulled a U-turn, and parked along the curb in front of St. Jude's Catholic Church. Most days, she would disappear into the chapel for 10 minutes, where she would light a votive candle, pray a decade of the rosary. Ginny tells me that indeed is possible. Then re-emerge to return up the road past the water tower, recross the overpass, and hang a left down the southbound ramp for Clearwater and the scrap metal processing center. But today was Christmas. When Meg dismounted from the truck and walked across the St. Jude's parking lot, past the concrete Virgin Mary sheltering beneath the protruding half of a vintage bathtub buried in the vertical, she was carrying her best dress, hung and sheathed in dry cleaner's plastic. Today the truck would sit parked all day long at the curb as Meg assisted Father Carl in the celebration of both Christmas morning masses. She was weary, having returned from midnight mass only a few hours previously, and prior to that, having spent Christmas Eve day dissecting the combine, tamping down the Festiva, and loading the truck. But for Meg, devotion trumped all. If it seemed strange that she had driven to Christmas services in a loaded junk truck, it helped to know that it was her only vehicle. If Meg was invited to remove a beached Buick from someone's yard, she arrived in the junk truck. If she had been invited for cocktails, she would have arrived in the junk truck. St. Jude's Catholic Church was nothing fancy. No soaring arches like the church in Boomler. No frescoes. No life-size, lifelike, bleeding and bethorned Christ mannequin nailed to a towering cross of solid plaster. Rather, the crucifix that hung above Father Carl during services was punched from polished brass, the suffering Son represented in abstract fashion, his halo formed of tack-welded wire. St. Jude's had been constructed in the late 1960s from blueprints composed by an architect apparently heavily influenced by early brutalism and post-war basement rec room. The exterior was done up in concrete and browns, and the interior ran heavily to blonde paneling. The pews were padded with naugahyde. The carpet was a close-nubbed tan and mustard-striped affair, the texture of a polyester pot scrubber, and the figurines representing the 12 stations of the cross hung on their plaques like dated bowling trophies. The mustachioed, long-haired disciples looking like gentle folk rockers. In short, you could imagine Michelangelo giving the whole works half a star. There were no bells in the belfry, rather a set of metal horn speakers hidden in a cupola that blared out tape-recorded chimes. But every single time Margaret Magdalene Jankowski stepped through the doors of St. Jude's, dipped her fingers in the holy water, and crossed herself, she thought, no, felt, only one word: sanctuary. And it did my heart good that Ginny had put a pink Post-it note right beneath the word sanctuary, and there too she wrote yes and underlined it 3 times. I wanted to convey that respect. So there are only 2 other characters I haven't talked about, and I'll describe them briefly, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. I save one little selection for the end. There are 2 other characters. The one other character is a woman named Carolyn, who is a disgraced academic who wound up in Swivel after, it's a fairly complicated story, but in short, she violated a speech code that she herself had written. So she comes to Swivel to get her life back together, and when she arrives there, she's shocked at the state of culture and takes it upon herself to enculturate the people of Swivel. I say in the book that Carolyn thinks of herself as a woman of the people having never been consulted. And among the things that she does, she likes to make dream catchers, and she makes a bunch of dream catchers and puts them up for sale in the local gas station. Unfortunately, over the course of the first year she lives in town, she sells only 1 dream catcher, and that was to a drunken fisherman who mistook it for a musky lure. So Carolyn faces an uphill battle. However, in the early draft, having not written fiction before for an adult audience, I doubted myself, and I'm glad I did, because I took the sections about Carolyn and I sent them to a friend, and he happens to be an Iowegian at this point. His name is Dean Bacopoulos. He has a novel coming out very shortly called Summerlong, and he teaches at Grinnell, and we've known each other for years. And I said, can you just read this part? And I mainly had sent it to him because he exists in the academic world, and I don't, and I wanted to see if I'd gotten things right. And he sends it back, and he said, you know, this is funny what you've done to this character. It's very entertaining, got a lot of chuckles. But he said, you're so hard on her, you never let her up. And he goes, that's not going to play well. He said, you have to think about who she is now, but then think about who was she when this all started. She was a poet. She wanted to write poetry. She had hopes. She had dreams. And there's a reason she pursued this degree. And I'm so grateful to Dean for that, because if you read the book now, it is my hope, at least, that Carolyn goes from being a caricature to someone we actually care about. And the same is true even with Knut Sorensen. Thanks to what Dean told me, I went back and looked at how I'd cast him and hopefully made things a little more complex. The one other character that I haven't described is Harley's love interest for most of the book. Harley's a bachelor. He's not a swinging bachelor, but he's looking. And one day he's single, he's not dating anybody, and he gets a hankering to go for a drive in his old pickup truck. And before he goes, there's a specific kind of drive he has in mind. It's a cold winter day. He wants to drive his old truck with the heater blowing, and he wants to be drinking a styrofoam cup full of gas station coffee while he's eating the gas station pastry. Sometimes a guy knows exactly what he needs. And so he goes, drives over to the gas station. He goes in there, and he's got his coffee, and he's holding his well, specifically maple frosted Long John cream filled. Again, sometimes the guy knows just what he wants. The problem is they're both the kind of things, especially that maple frosted cream-filled Long John, that you're horrified to be seen in public with. And so he's going to check out, and he turns around, and he bumps into this woman, and he spills coffee all over her boots. Now, I try to sneak things in there for those of us in the flyover states now and then. And what happens with Harley is when he spills the coffee on her boots, he looks down and he notices immediately two things. One is that they are very high quality leather work boots. But even better, he notices that when the coffee hits the leather, it beads up. See? So he knows she's been oiling up that leather and taking care of it, and his heart just skips a beat. So they have a brief exchange, and then he's very flustered and he can't really leave fast enough. But he gets into his truck and he stops at the road with his turn signal on, and he waits and he watches in his rearview mirror because he wants to see what kind of vehicle she gets into. And she comes out and she climbs into a red F-250 four-wheel drive pickup truck. And that's great, but even better, he notices that it's a big old four-wheel drive, but it's wintertime and she's got skinny tires on it. And if you know anything about driving in the snow, you know, oh, those are far better than those big, meaty, fat tires that a lot of fellas want to put on there. And so he sees that's smart. And then the topper is he sees she's got a big steel headache rack mounted behind the cab, and hanging from the headache rack is her own personal set of tire chains. And at that point, he's just gone. So those are all the characters and the setup and the premise. I have one little section that I'll read right at the very end, but at this point I always open it up to questions. You can ask me whatever you want, you know, about writing, this book, the other books, hair care tips, always, whatever you got. I'm happy to discuss it. And if one person is brave enough to go first, then there'll be an avalanche, but it always takes that one first person. So thank you.
Yeah. Figured it might as well be me. How long did it take you to write this book?
So the how long did it take you to write the book question, I get quite a bit, and it's a hard one to answer because, so I'm full-time freelance. I don't have any steady gig other than just, I have a weekly newspaper column, and that's fairly new. I've been doing that just under 2 years, I think. And then I'm listed on the masthead of Men's Health magazine as a contributing editor. I'll get back to that in a second. But freelance, so what freelance means is that I just have to pitch stuff all the time, and the way I explain it, I get asked at writers' conferences a lot, where do you get your inspiration? And it's a legitimate question, and I love answering it. And what I say is, well, my muse is a little bald-headed guy named Jim. And he sits in a swivel chair 9 miles up the road from me at the Chautauqua State Bank, and he holds my mortgage. And if I don't write another book, he takes my house away. It's a symbiotic relationship. So I just am always coming up with story ideas, magazine articles, book ideas, and then pitching them and trying to get deals for them. So the reason I say this is that I don't just sit down and work on a book until it's finished. I'm always working on it whenever I can. So lately here, I've had about a book a year coming out. Last year, I wrote a book called The Scavengers, which is technically for middle grade, 8 to 12-year-olds. And it's got a strong female lead in it. But just between you and me, I wrote it for grown-ups. Because as a parent for 10 years now who's had to consume a lot of media for 8 to 12-year-olds, the best ones always have something happening for the adult in the room. So about a book a year, roughly, and in between writing all these pieces. I just have to say, I love saying that I'm a contributing editor at Men's Health magazine. First of all, the annual salary for a contributing editor at Men's Health magazine is $0. But just so that I'm not being ungracious, what it really means is that I have an editor that I've worked with for a long time, and I'll probably have 4 or 5 pieces a year in the magazine, and of course I'm paid for those. So it's I'm very grateful for it. I have an article in the current issue of Men's Health magazine about pigs, if you're interested. The other thing that I get a chuckle about being a contributing editor to Men's Health magazine, I don't know if you're familiar with the magazine or the fellas that they frequently put on the cover, but I haven't had an ab in my life, all right? And specific to that, if I did have an ab, I'm not absolutely certain that I would wax it. To each his own. Well, here's an embarrassing thing. She says, so six-pack means something different to me. I'm a writer from Wisconsin who's never had a drop of alcohol. Yeah, I don't even drink beer. Don't tell anybody, though. They'll take my writer's license away. It's not a big deal. When I say that, people often they go, and they think they either think it's a religious precept or that I'm in recovery, and it's neither one. I just never started, and I don't care to start, and at this point, I don't see any reason to. So it led to a great story, though. Well, in my opinion, you be the judge. I got called to jury duty in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, which is my hometown county, and it is Line East Country. It's the home of Line and Kugel's beer, but it's also, it's a pretty working class place, and so I get called for jury duty. It's a drunk driving case, and I thought, well, I'll never get chosen in a million years because I'm on the fire department. I've been on hundreds of accident calls, and they said, do you know the arresting officer? I didn't know her by name, but I said, yes, I can tell you, I know we've worked scenes together. So I thought lo and behold, I get seated on the jury anyway. So we get all seated on the jury. They bring in the defendant, they bring in the lawyers. The judge turns to address the court, and then he stops, and he swivels back, and he looks at us in the jury box. And he goes, we never asked, is there anyone on the jury who doesn't drink? And I go, and of course, I'm the only one. And he said, well, why is that? And I just said, and just never started, not a big deal, not in recovery, whatever. And he said, well, then do you think that if someone does drink alcohol, they're a bad person? And I said, well, if I did, I wouldn't have any friends. And like today, I got a nice laugh, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself, except the judge, with impeccable timing, waits a beat, and then he says, not in this county you wouldn't. So my joke got trumped by a judge, yeah. And then they sent me home, so I never was on the jury. Anyone else with any question? Yeah.
Hi. What was your exposure to storytelling as a kid? Did you have people who told stories a lot or stuff, or read or whatever?
Yeah, my exposure to storytelling as a kid was, in a way, was perfect. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't get into writing until I was out of college. I have a nursing degree, and this was all a very happy accident. I could not be more grateful. But because I was raised in that obscure fundamentalist Christian sect, there were many things we were not allowed, including no radio, no dancing, no movies. But Mom filled the house with books, taught me to read when I was 4. And I love to tell that story. And one night, we had a big family get-together. I wrote about this in one of the books. We have this informal get-together every Sunday night. If you're within range of my folks' home farm, you just show up there. And it can be anywhere from 5 people to 40 some nights. And it's just wonderful. And my father's a very quiet man, and he usually is sitting down at the end of the table somewhere. And we had a whole big crowd of us there, and I don't know how the subject came up, but we were talking about reading. And I said, oh, yeah, I could read when I was 4. And from way down at the end of the table, I hear my father say, well, kinda. I said, what do you mean, kinda? And he said, well, I remember when you were 4 and you were proud that you could read, as apparently you still are. And he said, and one day I was taking you out to the barn, he said, and I had you by the hand, and you were in your little green barn boots from Farm and Fleet, and we walked out behind the neighbor's truck, and he said, and you stopped, and you pointed at the tailgate, and you said, look, Dad, F-O-R-D, truck. So I think he was implying a certain sustained fraudulence from the age of 4. But the real upside of this was that because we didn't have a TV, radio, or anything in the house, we would have the neighbors over. And the church people got together all the time, and you sat and you visited, and people told stories. And my dad, who would, disavow might be too strong a word. He would want to speak for himself, but I'm not doing what he would have chosen for me. But he taught me to tell stories. He had stories, and they were always quiet, and they just kind of rambled along, and then somewhere along the line there was a payoff. And it's the same, my brothers. I've said, this weekly column I'm writing, I'm running out of ideas already, and I'm only 2 years in. And so people say, well, how do you come up with ideas? And I say, it's really hard. They say, well, how do you do it? And I said, well, usually I wait for my brothers to call. Because if you've read any of my books, you know my brothers are a pretty regular source of material. And this, I'm not just making this up. One day last year, I was at my desk. I had 2 hours until the deadline, and I had nothing but false starts. And I'm starting to get the prickly sweats and everything, and my phone rings, and it is my brother, John. And I pick it up, and he's calling to tell me that he was working in his shop. He's a big bearded backwoods guy, and he talks pretty deliberately. And he was working in his shop on a grinder, and the grinding wheel exploded, and a chunk of the wheel flew off and essentially shot him in the neck. Just missed his carotid artery. And so we're talking, you know, 1/8 of an inch between a memorial service and a really excellent story. Because where I come from, nothing's funnier than pain. It's that whole working class thing where, like, nothing's funnier. You know, if your buddy gets hit in the head with a monkey wrench, nothing's funnier than your buddy. You know, once you've established that he's breathing and probably can walk, nothing's funnier than your buddy getting hit in the head with a monkey wrench. And I remember working on the neighbor's farm. His name was Jerry. He was an old Czechoslovakian immigrant. And he taught my father to farm. He took our whole family under his wing. And he was this very quiet guy. He didn't say much. He worked hard. But nothing to him was funnier than seeing someone get hurt. I mean, I remember helping fill silo with him, and I was hooking up the silo unloader, and I ran right into the silo pipe and just rang it like a bell. And he watched me kind of weave in there, and then he goes, are you going to be all right? I said, I think so. And then he just went, he just collapsed in laughter. So one time, he had a beautiful herd of Holstein milk cows. And unfortunately, one of his very best cows became very, very ill. And he had called the vet several times. Nothing was working. She just got progressively worse and worse. And finally, she couldn't even stand or eat, and she's in misery. And so he calls my brother, my younger brother, Jed, and he says, can you come over and put this poor cow out of her misery? Because my brothers were hunters, and they had a rifle. And my brother says, yeah, I'll be right over. So he comes over, comes in the barn, goes up in the manger, stands in front of the cow, takes his rifle, and puts the poor cow out of her misery. They then, of course, have to get the dead cow out of the barn. So my brother backs the tractor up to the barn door, and then they run a cable all the way from the back of the tractor, and then they tie it off on the hind leg of the cow, and then my brother starts very slowly dragging the cow out. And Jerry, the old Czechoslovakian neighbor, he's got one really bad knee, and he's just standing there watching the cow, and he's not noticing that as the cow's being dragged out, one leg got hung up in the stanchion, is getting drawn way back like this. Well, when it clears the stanchion, it whips around and smashes him in his bad knee. And so he's just bouncing around on one leg, tears streaming down his face. And my brother Jed says, you gonna be all right? And Jerry says, I think so. And Jed says, because I got one more shell. So the pain thing is just a source of great stories. And so here I am at my desk wondering, how am I going to come up with a column? And my brother John calls to say he's been shot in the neck with this, or as he put it, he said, yeah, got me right in the gozzel. It's like, I hadn't heard the word gozzel in decades. And so I said, well, where are you calling me from? He said, the parking lot at Farm and Fleet. And I said, what are you doing there? And he said, I'm going to get me one of them full frontal face masks. And I'm pretty sure that's not what it says on the box. But he said, yeah, everyone always told me if you're going to run a grinder, you should wear one of them full frontal face masks. I always thought that was kind of silly. But this has been a behavior-altering experience. And so, of course, I'm just sitting there going, type that baby up and send it in, and it was like, piece of cake, you know, and another column finished. So it really comes from, even when I worked on the ranch in Wyoming, I mean, we would sit around and tell stories. And while these folks would deny that they're storytellers, they are. So that's where I think it basically came from. maybe one more question if there is one. Otherwise, I can close.
So will your next book, will it be a novel, or are you going to go back to the?
I have 2 books in process. The next one it's due in December is a nonfiction book, a little bit kind of coming back toward memoir. It's not fully memoir, but a little bit. And it's a book about the French philosopher and essayist Michel de Montaigne, or Montaigne, or Montagne, depending on which public radio station you're on. But we just call him Montaigne where I'm from. And I'm writing about him, which is a little daunting. It's something I've always wanted to write about, but there have been so many fine books written by fine scholars. But the working title on this one, we'll see if it survives, is Montaigne in Barn Boots. So we'll see what happens. And then I owe the publisher a sequel to The Scavengers. And so I'm working on that, hoping I can get it out in 2016. And in the meantime, just doing a whole bunch of other stuff. In addition to the writing, I'm on the road about 60 to 100 days a year, and I do little one-man shows in theaters, and I have a band. We do about 10 or 15 shows a year. I started a band, and my wife said, you can have a band as long as it operates in the black. And shortly after that, we signed a little record deal, much to her dismay. But it's a lovely adjunct. Obviously, there's a lot of cross-pollination between the music crowd and the books. So that's what I'm working on. I'll tell you what. Oh, go ahead.
Wait, just a sec.
Oh, they need the microphones, because we're on TV.
John
Did a lot of
Prine.
makeup, as you can see. I hope they got the glare filter in.
John Prine is my favorite songwriter. How did you come to write the liner notes for one of his CDs? Did I read that?
Close, yeah.
Okay.
So John Prine, people always ask me about my literary influences, and I start rattling off names like John Prine and Steve Earle and Lucinda Williams and James McMurtry and Ray Wiley Hubbard, who I'm going to quote in just a second. Because I came to all this backwards, and it was a lot of singer-songwriters were the first ones to suggest to me that John Prine's a great example. Oh, you can be kind of a blue-collar guy from the Midwest and care about beauty and lyric. So my buddy Gene, I was in his basement sometime around 1992 because I was living in his basement. And we were playing darts. I probably should have been looking for a job. And he said, oh, you got to listen to this. And he put a cassette in the boombox, and it was John Prine. I'd never heard anything like that. And so over the years, I've written about how much I like him. And then I have this buddy. We're not best buds. I feel like I need to make some disclaimers so I don't sound like I'm climbing on his coattails. We're not best buds or confidants, but we work together a lot. And currently, we're working on a big project together. We're also neighbors. But I've known him for years. He used to be in my band. And back when he had no money and was sad and lonely, he recorded an album for me. I have an album called Headwinded, and he and I recorded this album in his basement and next to a pile of his dirty laundry. It wasn't his basement, he was renting at that time. He was just this kid, talented musician with no money. And we recorded this album together. Well, since then, he's gone on to win 2 Grammys. He tours all over the world. And his name is Justin Vernon. He has a band called Bon Iver. And in the wake of all of his success with that band, Bon Iver, some call it Bon Iver, some call it Bonnie Bear. He took the name of his band from the show Northern Exposure. They say, the character in there always says Bon Iver, which is French for good winter, and it's spelled, in the French, it's spelled Bonhiver. Well, when Justin started his band Bon Iver, he loved the show Northern Exposure. He wanted to pay tribute, but no one, of course, ever knows how to spell or pronounce the name of his band, and he took the H off. It's just Bonhiver, and he said, yeah, because I thought the H would confuse people. I was like, I don't think you really solved anything. So, but anyway, he had all this wonderful success, and as a result of that, he built a little studio out in the middle of nowhere in rural Wisconsin. Just happens to be literally a couple of cornfields away from me. And so one of the wonderful things is that all of my audiobooks, that I record all my own audiobooks, except for The Scavengers, which was done by an actor from New York. But and I record all of them in his studio, in his wonderful studio. And the really cool thing is that when you're recording your audiobook and you want to, you can go hang out with his Grammys. And because they're on the back of the toilet in the basement bathroom. It's just his way of keeping himself humble, I think. But anyway, he has wound up doing all these wonderful projects. I mean, I cannot tell you that this is in the middle of nowhere, and the people who have come to record there, it's amazing. I mean, I can say it now because it came out in the news. For a while it was quiet, but Kanye West wanted to record with Justin. And so Justin said, well, here's where Wisconsin is. And he came to, I mean, he's out in the middle of the Wisconsin cornfields recording whatever Kanye is recording these days. So I'm getting to answer your question. Justin was asked to put together a tribute album to John Prine with a whole bunch of musicians performing John Prine songs. And he asked me if I would help him write the liner notes, and so we co-wrote the liner notes. Probably the biggest privilege I've had that tied to Justin and liner notes is Justin produced and recorded right there in rural Wisconsin the Blind Boys of Alabama album. And I'm going to get the title wrong. I'll find a way, I want to say. I wasn't prepared for this. But I got to write the liner notes for that and to be at the recording sessions and see just, you know, again, an agnostic knucklehead just weeping at gospel music, beautifully done, yeah. So that's how that all came to be. So, and I tell Justin, you know, he was in my band once, and I tell him, you'll come crawling back. So, and we'll have a band meeting and we'll have a vote. So here's the deal. I've kept you an hour. If you have more questions, I'll stay as long as you like up here. I'll sign books. If you brought a book and you want to sign, I'm happy to do that. If you just want to say howdy, I'm happy to do that. Obviously, the wonderful and legendary Prairie Lights booksellers are here. They can sell you books right outside the door, and I'll be up here. But I can't express, before I read this closing piece, I just want to say thank you so that I don't forget to do it. None of this was planned. I'm this guy from rural Wisconsin who wound up writing by accident. I self-published 4 books before I ever had a book deal, never saw any of this coming. And why I really want to say thank you is that right now my wife is at home. And she's always at home, holding it together. She's taking care of our kids, she's taking care of our farm, and she does her own teaching in her own right. And this is how we, and I say we because she is part of this. I'm the one who goes out and makes the silly jokes, but without her, I wouldn't be here. And this is how we support our family. We're a little self-employed business. Our product just happens to be my typing. So when I say I'm grateful to you for coming out tonight, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. And if you want to know more, go to sneezingcow.com. And some of you know why, that's why it is. But so I'm going to close. One of the great influences on me early on, and this ties into the singer-songwriters, is I loved poetry. I went to my very first poetry reading long after I was out of college, and I couldn't believe people were doing this. And I started going, and I had a friend who one night kept me up all night long just feeding me poetry books because he was a poet. And he said, here, Lucille Clifton, read Rita Dove, Sharon Olds, Frank Stanford, Theodore Retzke, Dylan Thomas. And it changed, that night, we stayed up till 4 in the morning, and it changed my life. And I tried to be a poet for a while because I like how Dylan Thomas said poets choose words for their taste over their meaning, and I love that idea. And I tried to be a poet for a while, wasn't very good, but it stayed with me, and to this day I read a lot of poetry, and I try to sneak it into my writing whenever I can. And over 10 years ago, I was at a reading, and there was a poet there by the name of Honoré Fanon Jeffers, and she read a poem, and I hope if you have time, you'll go to the front of the Jesus Cow because she's fully credited in the front. In the text, as you'll see, the way it's presented, it needed to be a little bit nebulous, but she is fully credited in the front, and I hope you'll look up her and look up her wonderful work. But she read this poem, and for a lapsed Christian agnostic stumbler like me, there were 2 lines in there that just struck me to the core. They were beautifully written, they were very simple, but they were also powerful. And for over a decade, I carried them around, and I so wanted to work them into a book, and I never had the opportunity until I wrote the Jesus Cow. So I'm going to close tonight with that selection. I think just to give you the setting, I need to let you know that at this point in the story, Harley, this thing has started to spin out of control for him, and he's fairly depressed. He also knows that his relationship is possibly in trouble, and so he goes out to the overpass to have some time alone. The other thing you need to know is that, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, Billy often quotes Waylon Jennings, but in this particular selection, you'll hear him change it up, and you'll hear the name Ray Wiley Hubbard. And Ray Wiley Hubbard is a singer-songwriter out of Texas, one of my all-time favorites. His lyrics and his music speak to me profoundly, and it was my pleasure to use a Ray Wiley Hubbard lyric as the epigraph for this book, and then to quote him in this section. Tonight, as Harley placed his forearms on the bridge rail and leaned out over the 4-lane, the moon was coming up full. As another set of taillights slid away beneath him in the dark, Harley knew part of the attraction to this spot was the implication that he could always catch that southbound lane, push the foot feed to the floor, drive off into the night, and just keep driving. He glanced back over toward his farm and saw the security light glow, and above it all, the scrolling, pixelated steer. So to advertise, they've turned this thing into a full-blown attraction now, and they mounted a full-color LED screen on the town water tower so that people on the interstate could see it, and it advertises what's going on. He glanced back over toward his farm and saw the security light glow, and above it all, the scrolling, pixelated steer, chasing its own message, "See the Jesus cow." Suddenly, the southbound lane seemed more attractive than ever. But of course he couldn't go. "You can't just quit, son," said Billy, when Harley had broached the idea once before. "Look at all the people you're employing. Look at all the mouths you're feeding and recharging the government coffers, for which we, the taxpayers, and we on some form of the dole, thank you. But you're also helping a lot of those people believe. It might not be for us, but for many of those people you've brought great peace, great hope." "Yeah, but I, said Billy, shaking his head. "Let me put it another way. You ain't the only one bleeding here." "Waylon again?" "Nah, Ray Wiley Hubbard, my sort of prophet." And then there was Mindy, the woman he'd been dating. They'd had a good stretch lately, but he'd still get in those funks, and no woman should have to put up with a self-pitying infant of that order. And that damned crack he made about her wanting him for his money. He worried what kind of rotten little seed that might have planted. He moved closer to the railing, leaned over just enough to catch the vertiginous zing in his gut. Then it faded, and he stared off toward the rising moon, tan and brown, and looking as if it had been dunked in tea. He was recalling a line from a poem now, or it might have been some gospel blues song. He couldn't recall the source. Something from back in his college days. But in his head, it was the voice of a strapping, strong woman, and the line, or the fragment of the line, went, "You ain't prayed in so long." "You ain't prayed in so long." He said it aloud, softly, and to himself. There was another line that came on the heels of that one, but he couldn't recall it. He looked over the railing again. There was the desire to fling himself over, that barely repressible urge. He quailed at the idea of his body going smack, but the image he received of his easy double gainer through the silent air was beautiful and calming. He wondered how amazed folks might be, having watched his stolid movement through life thus far, to know how close to the edge he sometimes ran. "You ain't prayed in so long." Once, twice, 3 times he said it. Then he went silent and let it echo in his head. "You ain't prayed in so long." Now it was the strapping, strong woman again. Her tone was gentle, but bore reproach. She spoke gravely and with disappointment, soft, like she was shaking her head. "You ain't prayed in so long." And then the next line came to him. "Why bother with fancy now?" She sounded stronger on that one. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the library for having me.